Bible Alive, Bible Basics. Class 1, All Translations Are Betrayals, Part 1 of 2. The following presentation would be impossible without these resources, especially 101 Questions and Answers on the Bible by Father Raymond E. Brown. This playlist presents a basic introduction on sacred scripture. Consider it How to Boil Water course on the Bible, the sacred, normative, and inspired library of the Church. Basic stuff. And what follows are basic questions Catholics and other Christians have about the Bible. The majority of these questions that are presented here represent real questioners, those of real questioners, and they reflect many had by many Christians concerned about the Bible and its use. This particular class is in two parts, and it deals with English translations of the Bible, popular translations, the limitations of human language, and how to choose a good translation. When a person decides to read and study the Bible seriously, usually his or her first question is, which? Which Bible do I buy? Which translation is the best one for me to use? And at home, many of us Christians have Bibles, but they tend to be very large, given to us at weddings and other great Christian ceremonies. And they tend to be very old-fashioned in language. And besides that, the family Bible they tend to be very big, very cumbersome to carry, very clumsy to use for reading. So this isn't the best one to use if you're diving into reading the Bible. What then should one look for in a Bible to be used for reading and study purposes? The most appropriate Bible translation has to be judged from your purpose in reading. Let's say you're publicly reading, like on a Sunday service or in a communal service. That would require a translation with a certain solemnity. Therefore, highly colloquial translations just are not appropriate for that purpose. But for private reading, on the other hand, the purpose of spiritual reflection and refreshment sometimes gets best served by a translation that has an eye-catching, user-friendly style. Other private reading, for example, for the purpose of very careful scholarly study, would require a more literal translation that preserves the difficulties and ambiguities of the original. But perhaps the best overall answer is to point out that in the original Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek texts, those are the languages of the biblical peoples, the languages of the biblical books, there are phrases that are difficult to understand and are ambiguous. There's ambiguity because sometimes the authors, ancient Middle Eastern Mediterranean people, did not write clearly. So translators have to guess at meaning a certain percentage of the time. Therefore, they have to interpret. They must make a choice either to translate literally, preserving the obscurity of the original, or to translate freely and resolve the ambiguity of the original. This sometimes betrays the original authors and what they were intending. The meanings of some biblical texts are unknown or uncertain. Some Hebrew and Greek words found in the Bible, they only occur one time, but nowhere else in other ancient literature. What do I have to compare this word to in order to get what it means, to derive its meaning? The exact meaning of these terms is unknown. And some biblical phrases are ambiguous, with more than one possible meaning. Ancient languages are very different from modern languages. Not only do ancient Aramaic, Hebrew, and Greek use completely different alphabets and vocabularies, their grammatical rules and structures, their word order, prepositions, conjugations of verbs, and so on, they're very alien to modern English. Every translation is already inevitably an interpretation. Anybody who knows more than one modern language realizes that translations often have meanings that are slightly different from the original, and that different people inevitably translate the same text in slightly different ways. That makes us see things differently concerning the Bible. We have not always seen Scripture the way we do in modern times. In the times of the Church Fathers, because aspects of the Bible were difficult even for them to understand, they assigned allegorical meanings to the sacred texts. For example, Gregory of Nyssa in the 4th century said, "Everyone knows that the 4 horses pulling the chariots of the Egyptians in the Exodus account stand for the human passions that drive us humans toward sin." Is that true? Everyone knows that? Did you know that? That those aren't really talking about horses, they're talking about passions? See what he did? He allegorized the text, gave it a symbolic meaning that really had no relation to what the author of Exodus originally intended. This was allegory gone wild. The way we look at the Bible has changed with the times. There's been a big change in the way we view it because over the last hundreds of years there have been discoveries. Tremendous and rapid advancements in communications and transportation technology have brought us into a global village. Now it's not just a game played by white, male Europeans. Archaeological discoveries in the 19th and 20th centuries. New knowledge of ancient languages, cultures, and history. Discoveries of other ancient documents containing writings similar in style and thought to those found in the Bible. New knowledge about the age of the earth and its history. New scientific methods, including the study of languages. And the discovery of many older manuscripts of both the Old and New Testaments. Only recent translations take into account the discovery in the 1850s of our oldest and best manuscripts of the New Testament. The Dead Sea Scrolls, unearthed in 1947, gave us Old Testament texts 1,000 years older than our previous manuscripts. And we have discovered that there were many variants of Old Testament texts at use even in Jesus' day. Indeed, there are many variants among the various manuscripts of both the Old and New Testament texts. Looking closer, in light of these discoveries, scholars working within the church see that you have to look a little closer at Scripture. It became apparent that the Old Testament texts evolved over a long period of time, frequently were rewritten. The New Testament texts also evolved and were written in the light of the issues being faced by the early Jesus group communities. This presents to us big, wonderful problems. What do we mean by inspiration? Do we mean dictation? Looking at all of this, we have to change the way in which we had to read the text. New questions get asked. We say that God is the primary author of Scripture. Okay, but he certainly didn't dictate it. What do we mean by him being the primary author of scriptural texts if those texts have been rewritten many times over many generations? What do we make of the variations found within the manuscripts? And by what criteria are we going to use to determine what is an accurate original text of the Bible? The way we look at things changes what we mean by things like inspiration. One of the things we discover, quite shockingly, is that there is no original Bible. Think about that for a moment. We have discovered that there is no original text of the Bible. Our sacred library has been reworked and re-edited so many times. The published texts today we have are the result of a scholarly determination of the most likely final copy of the edited texts. That brings me to translation interpretation philosophies. There's 2 basic philosophies or styles of translation: literal, also called formal correspondence, and free, also called literary or dynamic equivalence. Other popular versions of the Bible in English are not really translations, but are paraphrases instead. Word for the wise: please avoid paraphrases. Very bad. Here are some literal Bible translations. The King James Version, 1611. The Authorized Standard Version, 1901. The Revised Standard Version, 1952. The New King James Version, 1982. The New American Bible, 1970, with its Revised New Testament and Revised Psalms in 86 and 91. The New International Version, popular among evangelicals, 1983. The New Jerusalem Bible, 1985. The New American Bible Revised Edition, 2011. Anyone who knows Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek would be able to translate these English versions back into their original languages almost perfectly with relative ease. Now here are some free Bible translations. The Jerusalem Bible, 1966. The New English Bible, 1970. Today's English Version, also called the Good News Bible, 1976. The Revised English Bible, 1989. And the Common English Bible, 1996. Meaning for meaning literary translations produce a simplified text for easier reading. The major concern of this kind of translation is that the English text should occasion in the reader the same effect as the original would. Literal or formal correspondence translations try to stick as closely as possible to the original wording and word order of the Hebrew and Greek texts. Understood that way, you can see that these are word-for-word translations. That means that they may seem more accurate or literal, but often they require detailed explanations and footnotes to avoid being misinterpreted by modern readers. Americans are low-context readers. The Bible comes from a high-context culture. Its language is high context. Literal or word-for-word translations are good for in-depth academic study of the Bible, but they may be less suited for public proclamation because they can be difficult to understand when they are heard or read aloud. Free or dynamic equivalence translations try to put the sense of the original text into the best modern English. They remain close to the ideas expressed, but they don't always follow the exact wording or word order of the Hebrew or Greek originals. So these are meaning for meaning translations. That means that they may seem less literal than the formal correspondence translation, but can be just as faithful to the original text and are therefore, generally speaking, better suited for public proclamation or liturgical use. Here's an example of free translation. The Polish language has one set of words for aunt and uncle on one's father's side, and a different set of words for aunt and uncle on one's mother's side. The difference is so important as to require special renditions in translation. A more literal translation would be my paternal uncle or my maternal aunt. But, in our English-speaking culture, that kind of sounds awkward. We don't talk like that. We don't think like that. We don't perceive things like that. We don't interpret that. That's not our social system. We don't communicate that way. We prefer simply aunt and uncle. So, in free or dynamic equivalence translation, meaning for meaning translation, we sacrifice the precision of the Polish language for the clear general meaning. Aunt, uncle, that's sufficient for us. Let me show you how this applies to the Bible. How should one translate into English the German Vater, the Spanish Padre, the French Père, the ancient Greek Pater, and I could add also the Hebrew Abba? Tell me, do we learn to speak English in German soundings and spellings? Do we learn to speak English in Spanish soundings and spellings? Do we learn to speak English in French soundings and spellings? And do we learn to speak English in Greek and ancient Hebrew soundings and spellings? Is that how we learn to speak English? No. Some people would say that the German Vater, the Spanish Padre, the French Père, or the Greek Pater, and I would add the Hebrew Abba, all are the same thing and translate into English as father. Some might even say daddy. But I want you to think about this. What kind of images come into your mind, your American mind, when you hear the word father? Are these some of the images taken from our social system and culture? Are any of these honest to how Abba and Pater is in the Bible? The word father, English word, used in English-speaking non-bilingual United States communities, refers to persons who fulfill the roles, behaviors, and values expected of adult males in prevailing American society. The meaning of the word father derives from the roles, behaviors, and values practiced in mainstream American society. That's how we use it. The meanings of words like father or any word do not derive from lexica and dictionaries. The meanings of words derive from social systems. This is very important to understand. While we might translate padre or fater or père with the English father, the accuracy of the translation is doubtful, since the social roles of each of the persons called by those names in their respective languages is not the same as in American society, mainstream American society. A more accurate translation of padre would be Spanish father. More accurate translation of vater would be German father. The more accurate translation of père would be French father, and on and on. And what would be the way we properly translate Abba and Pater? Well, let's look at this concretely in a passage from the Gospels. Matthew chapter 11, verse 25 to 27. At that time, Jesus exclaimed, I give praise to you, Pater, Lord of heaven and earth, for although you have hidden these things from the wise and the learned, you have revealed them to little ones. Yes, Pater, such has been your gracious will. All things have been handed over to me by my patros. No one knows the huios except the pater, and no one knows the patera except the huios, and anyone to whom the huios wishes to reveal him. Is that easy and simple to translate? Should we put daddy, American daddy, or American father into pater, and American son into huios? Or does the author of Matthew have in mind, and did Jesus have in mind, something more Mediterranean? For instance, a patron who has surplus and does justice by giving of his surplus to poor clients who are made his kin, as if they were his flesh and blood children. You see, the meanings associated with words like pater and abba, like fater and père and padre, differ from culture to culture. So again, because of ambiguities, translators must interpret. They must sometimes guess at the meaning a certain percentage of the time. They must also have to make a choice, either to translate literally, word for word, preserving the obscurity of the original, or translate freely, resolving the ambiguity of the original. It's very difficult to put one language into another language. The Italian proverb, traduttore traditore, every translator is a traitor, is a formidable fact. Rarely is there a one-to-one equivalence from one language to another. The translator is inevitably going to have to make an unfortunate choice of words. Take this passage from Genesis 31:35. Rachel said to her father Laban, do not let my Lord be angry that I cannot rise in your presence. Kiderek nashim li. Question, what does the Hebrew kiderek nashim li mean? It literally, word for word, states, because the way of women is upon me. That the best way to translate that? That's vague. What does she really mean? In plain English, what does that mean? How would you translate it? Which translation of the possible translations would you prefer to be that you think is the best, and why is that your preference? Not so easy. Not so easy. Genesis 31:35. Rachel said to her father Laban, "Do not let my lord be angry that I cannot rise in your presence. Kidedek nashim li." Let's look at some translations. King James Version, literal translation. And she said to her father, "Let it not displease my lord that I cannot rise up before thee, for the custom of women is upon me." Custom? Jerusalem Bible Free Translation, Genesis 31:35. Then Rachel said to her father, "Do not look angry, my lord, because I cannot rise in your presence, for I am as women are from time to time." That's very different than the King James. You see the difference there? Interesting choices are being made. Revised Standard Version literal translation. And she said to her father, "Let not my lord be angry that I cannot rise before you, for the way of women is upon me." Way, custom. Today's English Version, Free Translation. Rachel said to her father, "Do not be angry with me, sir, but I am not able to stand up in your presence. I'm having my monthly period." Look at that interpretation. New International Version, literal translation. Rachel said to her father, "Don't be angry, my lord, that I cannot stand up in your presence. I'm having my period." So again, in plain English, what does Kidedek Nashim Li mean? How would you translate it? Of the translations I just showed you, which translation do you prefer? And why is that translation your preference? Folks, a literal translation needs to be accompanied by footnotes or commentary, suggesting possible resolutions of the obscurity that has been preserved in the translation. A free translation, meaning for meaning translation, represents a choice already made by the translators as to what they think an obscure passage really means. In a sense, the commentary is built into the free translated text. For that reason, a free translation is easier to read, but harder to make the subject of careful scholarly study. Things are messy in God's love.